Well, thank you for the opening session and a great way to kick off. And lovely to be here. And thanks again for the lovely hosting of the Platoon Foundation. My name's Erik Porse. I'm the director of the California Institute for Water Resources within UC-ANR, and as I mentioned, ex officio board member of the Rosenberg Forum. And I'll be moderating our second session here. And we'll have two speakers, one of which is myself, and we'll also have Dr. Carlos Aragon speaking as well. And the overall title of this session is Policy Approaches to Wastewater Management and Treatment in Spain and the United States. Now, a note as we start off, we did have another speaker, Dr. Elida Cantor, who was going to join us. Elida was very excited about joining us, but unfortunately was not able to join us due to an emergency out of Elida's control, which is very unfortunate. But we hope to have Dr. Cantor join us perhaps at a future Rosenberg event. And Dr. Cantor is a assistant professor at Portland State University and also very knowledgeable on these issues of water quality and policy and governance. So we'll start with an overview of policy approaches to wastewater management in the US. And this will help to provide some understanding of how we have, over the course of about a century, implemented programs for wastewater treatment within the US, more broadly across different states, looking at the state and federal relationships around this.
Is this okay?
Yeah, it's okay. I got it. So we have a number of different overlapping major regulations and policies for wastewater management in the US. And they all came together with the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. So the Clean Water Act was a piece of federal legislation that instituted something we call the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES. We'll talk a little bit about what that is in a moment. But the Clean Water Act is sort of the hallmark legislation, but we have others as well. So the Resource Control and Recovery Act in 1976, what we call the Combined Sewer Overflow Policy Control Act in 1994, and Federal Biosolids Policy in 1993. These are a selection of some of the pieces of federal legislation that govern aspects of how we manage wastewater in the US. In particular, the Combined Sewer Overflow Policy has a lot to do with historical perspectives on development of wastewater systems in Europe and the US, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what's important to recognize is this is a train of work and legislation that took almost an entire century in the US to understand how to develop. And so the policies that we have now in the US, in different states across the US, we have inherited the work of prior policymakers and wastewater engineers in this space. And it doesn't happen quickly, which is very important to recognize. So as I mentioned, the Clean Water Act is sort of our hallmark policy. And its official name is the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, passed in 1972. But this was a piece of legislation that brought together prior legislation over the course of essentially 3 decades. So there were prior acts in 1948, 1956, 1961, 1965, and 1970 that all dealt with pieces, anything from funding to regulations around wastewater management in the US. And in 1972, the US Congress decided that this fragmentation wasn't sufficient. And it brought together all of those pieces of legislation to be able to develop sort of a singular policy. And importantly, it created what's called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, as I mentioned. This is our system for permitting discharges to land and water in the US from wastewater that could come from industrial and municipal sources. And through the NPDES system, any entity, industrial or municipal discharger, who wants to release treated wastewater to some sort of environmental area must obtain a permit. And that permit has to have criteria within it that allow it to, that protects the water quality or the environmental quality of the location of where the discharges are going to. In practice, the Clean Water Act is actually coupled state and federal implementation. So we have at the federal level, they set the overall tone of the policy, they set the requirements, but full implementation is deferred to at the state level. And so state, typically in some sort of environmental protection agency, we call them different things in different states. In California, we have the State Water Resources Control Board primarily. They will implement the policies, and they are in charge of the monitoring, of enforcement, of implementation, and also funding, which we'll mention in a second. And if the states are not sufficiently implementing those policies, then the federal government may come in and step in. Now, a lot of politics can ensue here depending upon what the particular priorities are of given administrations at a particular level of government. So if there's a governmental entity that's less interested in aggressive regulation at the state level, but there is one at the federal level, you could have some conflicts that ensue, and the federal backstop might step in. And in the reverse, you could have a very active state, which creates challenges for maybe commercial entities who might look to bring their businesses elsewhere if they feel that the cost of cleanup is too great. So within the federalist system of the United States, there are a lot of intricacies that emerge from this implementation. And the last point to note about the Clean Water Act is over time, it's from especially focusing on conventional contaminants of biochemical oxygen demand as an indicator or total suspended solids to now dealing with more toxins and emerging contaminants, which we'll hear about throughout the day. Importantly, though, wastewater treatment in the US predates the Clean Water Act in most municipal areas. So from 1880 to 1910, about 3 to 9% of the annual infrastructure spending was on sewer and water in municipal areas. And in the graph on the right, you can see what you might think of as lumpy implementation of spending, which causes challenges. So between the federal and state and local, these are the main sources of funding that we will have for infrastructure in the US. Prior to, or around the turn of the century, local funding dominated, at a smaller scale, of course, aggregate scale, but dominated. And then as in the beginning of the 20th century, with what we call the sanitarian movement in Europe and the US, you had a large growth in state and especially federal funding. And this was very important because it set the tone of how infrastructure gets funded in the US, of the federal government potentially providing large investments of capital, and then state and local agencies having to identify how to maintain those systems over time. Around the 1900s, in the beginning of in the 20th century, most cities built combined sewers. This was sort of a long time discussion in the engineering community. Different approaches emerged elsewhere. In the US, many of the eastern cities built combined sewers. By the time we started developing in the West, there are many fewer combined sewers. There's really 2 in California, just in some of the older municipal areas. But this created a long-term challenge that wastewater managers would have to address over the next century. The idea of combined sewers, where you bring stormwater together with wastewater in the same system, it had a lot of benefits at the time because you can keep high flows through sewer systems that are not pressurized. But what ended up happening is as we grew more stringent in our environmental requirements, when you have large periods of rainfall, you would have sewage overflows into aquatic ecosystems, rivers, and it created huge challenges in the middle of the 20th century in the US. So the Clean Water Act regulations, as we heard in the keynote, has standards for both water quality in water bodies. So you can have requirements for the quality of water that's in a river or a lake or a stream. And then it also has what they call technology-based effluent standards. And this would be, say, % reduction in treatment that you have to achieve within a particular, what they'll call an element of a treatment train. And these two combine, and they're tailored to the regulatory situation of the facility that is receiving the permit. So these specific standards will be identified in each and every permit. And so for the better part of over 50,000, 65,000 different municipal and industrial support reporters across the U.S., they will all have an individual specified permit that has requirements for long-term monitoring and for water quality outcomes. It's an enormous system. There's an enormous amount of data created and generated through this, and it's an enormous infrastructure to be able to manage all of the acts of what the Clean Water Act requires. And the reporting chain will generally go local to state to federal. So local reporters, a locality or the actual specific municipality or the specific industrial reporter will be required to show monitoring records, and that will eventually go to a state agency, and then the state agency is also then reporting that up to the federal level as well. And so in states that are more active, they will have probably more autonomy generally in their relationship with the federal government. But even in places that have an active regulatory environment like California, you will still see the federal EPA institute requirements and standards when they see something that's not being met to adequate water quality outcomes. Now that's the, as we say in English, that's the stick. And then we also have the carrot as well. And so a large part of wastewater policy and just generally speaking water quality policy in the US has been to use carrots and sticks. And so if you institute requirements, in order to get those through, given our legislative process, you also need carrots. And the carrots in the US have largely been what we call the state revolving funds. These have been longtime institutions that go back to the mid part of the 20th century, where they are loan programs that provide low or even no interest loans to municipal borrowers, municipalities for purposes of building water infrastructure. And we have two main ones, and they're called the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And the Clean Water State Revolving Fund focuses on water quality, largely began with wastewater treatment, but now it can have a number of different, you can receive loans for stormwater management, even forest watershed restoration if that has a water quality outcomes as well. These clean water and drinking water state revolving funds, as it's named, are implemented at the state level. The state actually manages a revolving loan fund that gets it received a seed influx of capital from the federal government, and then it has to have some level of match. And these all have very complicated formulas associated with them for the allocations of this. And that has been a regular budget investment on the part of the federal government and the state governments for decades. And then the loans are revenue generating because they do have low interest outcomes associated with them. So the states manage a loan program that actually helps to offset some of the costs of new infrastructure. And so in this way, by reducing the interest burden of having to go out to the private sector for the capital and spreading the burden around different levels of government, municipalities have been able to build large amounts of infrastructure over the years. And especially it's led to hundreds of millions of dollars of investments in wastewater treatment. And the state revolving fund, as you can see, it gets the seed money from these two locations, and with the outcomes being water quality projects for drinking water treatment or wastewater treatment, and the bond holders being the agencies also have typically benefited from fairly high bond ratings because they're fairly safe investments from the perspective of market investors. There's been some bumps over the years, but overall, largely it's been a very successful program that has helped to reduce the costs of implementing infrastructure in the US. And especially in wastewater treatment, we still have a lot of municipal ownership of these facilities. That said, there are still enormous gaps. And in the past decade, we've started to try to quantify those gaps with much better numbers and data. So the left is a graphic from a report that was published by the U.S. Water Alliance and Dig Deep through a fairly large collaboration of engaged and thoughtful kind of policymakers in the space for a long time. Their conclusion, using census data, was that more than 2 million Americans live without basic access to safe drinking water and sanitation in the U.S. And others in the room might know better, but some of the metrics might be 1 to 2 for access to drinking water versus access to wastewater sanitation services. Regardless, in the first or second most wealthy nation in the world, this is just not acceptable. And that's been the argument that's been made over the past decade to try to improve the outcomes. And this isn't a new situation. It's come from decades of underinvestment on the part of just tax policies and infrastructure investment policies going back to the late 70s and 1980s. And in the previous administration, there was some large influxes of capital through several pieces of federal legislation that also tied the infrastructure investments to some extent with outcomes for environmental justice, which was a relatively new concept for such a large amount of investment all at once. It had happened in states to some extent, depending upon the state. Another important point from this report was that race is the largest predictor of water and sanitation access in the U.S. So it's sort of hit home in a lot of different ways. Here's a picture. There's been a lot of activity in a lot of different jurisdictions, but Alabama has been a real case study that the EPA essentially came in and sued and took apart the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund operations in those areas because they were deemed to have discriminatory policies. And centers such as the Center for Rural and Enterprise and Environmental Justice, Catherine Coleman Flowers, and others have been very active for a long time. So you can see here underinvestment with raw and open sewage flowing and makeshift pipes. Residents in a lot of these areas have been clamoring for wastewater connections up to local collection systems for a long time, and it hadn't happened. As I mentioned, there has been recent efforts that have boosted funding in the U.S. water sector. First, predating about 10 years ago, we had something called the Water Infrastructure Financing Innovation Act, or WIFIA. This is modeled after our transportation program as well. At first, I tried to understand WIFIA, and I couldn't understand what they were doing. It's kind of interesting. So basically what they do is the federal government doesn't really invest much. It's almost a zero-cost program. But they essentially, it's as if you're buying a house and you need some help buying a house, and someone signs on to the loan for you, and they provide the backstop. And it reduces the interest rate significantly for these investments. And so it's been a very successful program because it actually generates revenue just by the purposes of essentially co-signing a loan. So it's in a funding-constrained environment in the past 10 or 15 years in the US, just for tax increases, it's been very popular. And then we, as I mentioned, in the past administration, under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we had two large investments in infrastructure. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law specifically injected a lot of new funds into the state revolving funds. And as I mentioned, they changed the focus so that a certain portion of those funds were going into traditionally underserved communities based on outreach and recognizing that you can't necessarily provide funding to communities that don't have expertise or resources and just expect the systems to ensue. You need to actually have technical assistance programs that align with it. And the BIL provided funds for technical assistance as well. So I'll close with just a couple of challenges for the wastewater sector, and we'll hear more about this. But emerging contaminants in wastewater treatment are a huge area of concern at the municipal level. And for locations that are looking at wastewater reuse and recycling, this is especially troubling because you're having contaminants in the wastewater, and then you're needing to monitor for those and control for those before it's going back somehow into the drinking water system. The graphic on the left is for PFAS, but PFAS is, of course, a collection of chemicals that have been widely used, but it's certainly not the only one. So you can have naturally occurring contaminants, you can have manufactured contaminants, and then you have long-lasting contaminants such as PFAS. It's a suite of challenges for water quality systems that are traditionally designed and have been maintained to essentially treat a few instances, or a few types of contaminants, namely biological contaminants, suspended solids, and other types of nutrients. And last, what's the overall kind of status on climate change, resilience, and wastewater management? How are agencies in the U.S. doing? Well, it's sort of a mixed bag. Some of the research that's out there, including some surveys we've done in California, indicates that a lot of system operators, they're making investments and they're thinking about adaptation, but it's largely reactive, and they're not necessarily using future hydrological projections for larger storms and flows. There's not necessarily enough capital to design systems to do that anyway. And regulations are bigger drivers of change. So managers and operators, planners will respond much more to requirements than they will to sort of proactive actions to reduce risk from climate change. On the right, you can see an interesting graph. So Hurricane Sandy in 2012 in New York caused some significant issues for infrastructure there. And that's the 5-day influent flow to the wastewater system. Now, this is actually a success story. They were actually they were able to support a lot of treatment, and within a couple of days, the reporting indicated that they were well over 90% treatment, back to well over 90% treatment. But you see the spike there of influent into the system of essentially 3 times. This is what we're looking at when we have more extreme weather for wastewater treatment, just for precipitation. So with that, I'll stop and have some resources available for different water policy documentation in the US, and be happy to take questions.
Collaboration works with regard to the wastewater management. Based on my experience, particularly in Canada, the water resources, the promises are sitting on water resources, and sometimes it becomes very difficult, particularly when it came to the reporting of SDG 6. There were a lot of issues. So with regard to the wastewater management, is it smooth in the US, state versus the federal government? At the same time, is it also, you can say, smooth when it comes to the implementation of the Water Act at the state level? The same standards are actually applied, or the states have their own standards? So I just want actually to understand how this whole framework works across federal to state and to maybe to the local level. Yeah.
Sure. I'm not sure that I would ever characterize federalism as smooth. But generally speaking, because it's been the same system for a lot of years, the interactions are predictable, you might think, right? So it depends largely on the political context of the state. So if you have states that are more stringent, we'll take a couple of case studies. So let's say you have a state that is more proactive in sort of implementing wastewater treatment to promote water quality guidelines. They are likely to be able to have some relative policy freedom to implement that, to be able to develop the permits as they see fit. And the important part of that is those permits are based on a lot of research and data development. So there has to be monitoring for a long period of time before those discharge permits and the water quality standards or the treatment-based standards are implemented. And I think that helps to buoy some of the tensions that might happen between the different levels. But that's not to say, though, in developing the permit around wastewater treatment, it's been an evolution towards more stringent requirements, and there is a lot of engagement with the industry on some of the setting of those standards. So when you see new directives come out, such as the PFAS regulations, there's a huge amount of industry engagement that happens at the federal level and then also in state levels. And that engagement, in the best of situations, is positive and has positive outcomes because it's the idea of balancing costs with water quality requirements. But it's not always positive if you're an advocate for like water quality. So it's a balance based on the issues, and it's definitely coalition building. When we promulgate environmental laws, we will identify what the science indicates for some sort of goal that's maintaining either aquatic health or public health, and then we balance it with the costs that are associated to do that. And so it's especially true on drinking water side that you'll have a public health goal, and then what ends up getting instituted for maximum contaminant levels may be lower than the public health goal because the public health goal is not economically feasible.